Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Ethics of AI podcast.
I am your host, Matt Silk.
We're on to more episodes now, talking about some interesting different topics. And in this episode, we'll be talking about AI and education. And to do that, I have invited a guest. Her name is Cortney Hanna-Benson, and she is the Associate Director of Digital Learning at the University of Western Ontario with the Centre for Teaching and Learning. Hi, Cortney.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
Good. I'm very happy to have you on here. For one of our earlier episodes, we met a couple weeks back at a conference, and we were talking about AI and education, and we thought, well, it would be fun to talk more about these issues and in a little bit more depth, and in a public setting where other people can hear it.
I think that sounds great. I'm very excited.
So maybe before we jump into some of the questions, just wondering if you might want to, if you could tell us a little bit about yourself.
For sure. Yeah. So thank you. As you mentioned, I work at Western Centre for Teaching and Learning. And for those listening and perhaps unfamiliar, Western University is in London, Ontario, in Canada. We're a research-intensive university with about 40,000 students. So pretty large. And in our Centre for Teaching and Learning, we support kind of the university's teaching and learning mission. And we do that by providing training, mentorship, research, innovation opportunities for instructors at Western, so they can essentially take what they have gained from our work here at the center and use that learning to create high quality learning experiences for their students. And then in my role specifically, I oversee our center's digital portfolio. So topics kind of within that stream involve things like the LMS, our digital learning tools, and of course, probably most related to our conversation today is Gen AI in the teaching and learning space.
Cool. Maybe we'll get started talking about some of the work that you've been doing. So you work in digital learning. So I'm kind of curious to know what you think are the most significant issues involving AI in education today, both in terms of how education is administered and also in terms of how students are learning.
Definitely. There's so much happening in this space right now, and it all seems to be kind of very tightly tangled together. There's a few things that I'm maybe optimistic about, and some things that I'm kind of more concerned about. I like to position myself as a, pragmatic optimist. So maybe I'll start with the things that I'm excited about in this space. So somewhat of a threat I think Gen AI has posed in the higher education landscape is to our assessments and how we have been assessing. But kind of what's come of that is it's made folks really take a look at their assessments more deeply, and the value these assessments have kind of in different learning contexts. So, for example, you might be familiar with the Sydney two-lane assessment framework that positions assessments for and as learning, where there's kind of this opportunity for students to fail in those lower stakes assessments, and those failures through that assessment is the point of learning, is the point of the assessment there. And those assessments of learning, which is often used for kind of benchmarking or seeing where a student is at to be able to adequately judge whether they're ready to kind of move on to the next thing. And they make that distinction between those because the assessments of learning are usually in those invigilated spaces, obviously very resource intensive to have those. And because they're fully locked down, it's not exactly an assessment that you want to be. You don't want all of your assessments to exist in that format alone. It's not incredibly authentic as well. So AI has kind of been that catalyst at taking a good look at higher ed and our assessments and saying well, what are we doing here? What are we doing with this assessment? So that's been neat to see. Yeah.
I was just going to say it's interesting because AI seems to, in a lot of ways, make us rethink things, and I think that can be both interesting and also a little bit scary because we have to really kind of have to rethink what we're doing, what we're trying to accomplish with assessments, and so Just like in a lot of other cases, AI just sort of really makes you kind of rethink things from scratch and reconsider things that maybe for a long time were very comfortable.
Yes, absolutely. Comfortable, familiar. The position, like it was how I was assessed. So I'm familiar with this. And I know that it is a good assessment because it was the way I assessed. And now I am a scholar in this field and I will continue to assess in that way. So it's kind of shaking that up a little bit. Folks are getting very creative with their assessment strategies. It's also kind of cool to see, like with the tech itself. I've seen like kind of case studies come to life where you can like interact with a scenario, you can build simulations for your students, or you can have your students build these simulations with AI tools. In some like entrepreneurship environments where students would kind of write out a digital media strategy or talk about sort of what prototype they would develop, you can actually bring websites to life very quickly, or these brands to life, to kind of add a little bit more interest and excitement to the assessments. I was also going to add too, there's also been a lot of gains in accessibility with advances in AI. So things like audio captioning tools, I don't know if you remember, but kind of not even all that long ago, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, audio captioning at conferences or live events was often distracting because it was so bad. But with advancement in deep learning, and they're more context aware now, they're trained on like large amounts of audio data, so they're way more accurate now than traditional speech to text.
Sure, and I'm sure the training's a lot more diverse too.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting. Yeah, I know just from our own efforts with our meetings, it's valuable not only to have the transcript, but even to be able to use AI to kind of summarize the transcript or clarify things, even if the transcript itself is kind of messy on the page. You can actually clarify things, and it makes it a lot easier.
Definitely. It's I think AI has made great strides in the area of our tools and how they support accessibility, for sure. In terms of some elements that may concern me a little bit, and you probably had similar conversations at Waterloo, is that this idea that it's kind of like highlighting or maybe amplifying our lack of trust in each other. So I've heard very regularly, like everyone's using AI and not talking about it. So sometimes, yeah.
I was reading an article just a couple minutes ago, and it was talking a survey of teachers, and they just couldn't believe that students would want to cheat if given the opportunity in such large numbers.
As if cheating never existed before AI.
Or the incentive, the incentive wouldn't have always been there, essentially.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So this positioning of like all students are using AI to cheat, or students with their peers, right? Everyone's using AI and it's unfair to me, or it, puts me at a disadvantage if I don't. It's it's still so taboo to even talk about it. So I find oftentimes like those folks on those pole ends of that conversation, on that binary of adopting or resisting AI, it's easy to end up in an echo chamber because of a mistrust in the other end of the pole. And it's not always productive to be inattentive to diverse perspectives.
No, and it's interesting too because there are so many different ways that AI can be used. Like you said, it can be used for everything from testing, personalized testing, to accessibility issues and stuff like that. And not only is there a great diversity of different opinions, but there's a different diversity of understandings about how this stuff can be used and why students might choose to use it for certain reasons, or if there are certain particular circumstances that might lead them to want to use AI for certain kinds of things. And if that's not understood to everybody else, then that can create a lot of room for misunderstanding.
Absolutely. We do so much work in our center around perspective taking, particularly around values. So you as an instructor, like you bring your set of values with you to your classroom that would influence how you choose to adopt or not adopt AI in your teaching practices. But then it's also, we do a lot in creating awareness around alternate perspectives and the fact that your students are entering your class with their own set of values, which might align with using AI for under different circumstances. So I think raising awareness of the different perspectives and highlighting that nuance a little bit more has done a lot, I think, to advance the conversation beyond just I'm going to use it or I'm not going to use it.
Yeah, it's funny because we're still so very much early days with this kind of technology, and you have some people like even among students, it's kind of interesting where you see obviously there's a significant number of students who are using AI, but then on top of that, there's also a significant number of students who are critical or skeptical of AI and don't like it or don't want it to be integrated into education. So you still have a sort of perhaps even a degree of cognitive dissonance about like it's convenient and efficient in some cases, but we still don't like it in other cases. And I think people are still kind of trying to wrap their heads around this.
Definitely. Our students are so, I hear that more and more. They're rejecting AI for very valid reasons, for the ethics around it, for the environmental impact. They have so many reasons for why they do not want to engage with AI. And kind of in that same vein, in that same conversation, we'll say things like, well, I only use it to check my grammar. It's like, well, it seems like a comfy place to land.
It's interesting. I mean, because you can obviously compare it. If you're only using it for certain purposes, you can compare it to older technology. Spell check's been around forever. And I'm sure when spell check arrived, there were probably similar arguments about, decline of literacy skills and things like that. And so part of the issue is also trying to grasp, like, to what extent are these new problems and, where do we start drawing the line between, using it for things that are just sort of like time-saving measures and then having it actually do substantive work that most other people would care about.
Right. Yeah. What facet of that cognitive offloading, that work that we're delegating to AI, are we okay with?
No.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, perhaps maybe to get some insight on this, we were talking about this at our conference a couple weeks back, and you were sharing the details of this course that you were developing. Some graduate students and the science faculty at Western recently collaborated on a course to develop a policy for acceptable Gen AI use in science. Can you tell me about this course and what did you learn from it?
Yeah, definitely. It was a really neat approach. It was called Responsible Use of AI in Science, and it was a graduate course that was situated in the Faculty of Science at Western, though it was open to any graduate student from any discipline. We ended up with 21 graduate students in the class and one very keen fourth-year undergrad. And they came from various STEM disciplines, a student in education, philosophy. And because we use that students as partners approach, which I'll explain kind of more in a bit, it ended up being more about just responsible use of AI as like emerging researchers and students. So the course really sought to highlight those very diverse and nuanced perspectives on AI use. Because there's so many potential applications of where generative AI technologies could fit throughout the research process, there's really no prescribed way of engaging with AI to perform these research tasks. And it still feels a bit like trial and error. Like you mentioned that we're in the early days of AI, very much so. And it still kind of sits in this moral gray area. So you can imagine, consider like the power dynamics of this graduate student with their instructor, with their supervisor, even starting a conversation about where AI could belong in the research process, depending on who you bring that up to, like could earn you a scarlet A.
Yeah, it's a risk. It's a risk.
it's a risk for sure. And we wanted to create a space for folks to come together and have those discussions that dig into that nuance a little bit. So my colleague Ken Young, he's the Associate Dean Academic in our Faculty of Science. He was noticing this need to have these conversations. He had this idea of bring graduate students together in a course setting and talk about responsible use of AI in science. And so he and we had been chatting for a while. He had some suggestions. He had some thoughts on the course. I brought up kind of engaging it as in a students as partners way to bring the student insights and perspectives into selecting the course topics and design. So then he asked me to co-teach it with him. And it was great because he brings a very, he brings his perspective into the conversation. He sees AI as the way of the future, particularly in research and science. I lean a little bit more skeptical, critical. So it was a nice balance, and it was a great way to kind of model the fact that you will be working with people who think very differently than you around this topic.
Yeah, it's interesting too. I feel like to some extent there are people who are resistant to AI, and of course, they're with valid reasons. But their perspective changes slightly if they start using it. I mean, not always, super positive, but I mean, I do think a lot of people who use it for certain kinds of things suddenly discover, oh, actually, it can be useful for certain things, and there are ways you can use it in ways that are, ways to make things more efficient or save time or make things more accessible, but still have a degree of skepticism about using it.
I think the opposite has also shown true. Folks who were very enthusiastic to adopt AI out the gate started engaging with it a little bit more, learn more about it, and in sort of demystifying the tool and its kind of potential from what it was actually able to do, also changed the way folks engage with AI. So it's both and in opposite directions. At least what I'm finding through these conversations. But I think it is important, kind of wherever you are on the spectrum of AI adoption, to at least know how it works, what it is, and what it can do. A lot of folks who ended up in the "I will not use AI" camp, AI serves no purpose to me, might have tried ChatGPT out once in 2023. It generated something, not great, and then they wrote the tool off. And AI has had tremendous advancements in the last, 3 years, let alone the last 3 weeks.
Yeah, no, it's true. That's the thing. Even if you discover that, again, maybe it's not necessarily for you. I think it does change the way, just experiencing it a little bit can really change your understanding and appreciation for, even if it's not for you, why other people might choose to use it for different kinds of purposes. And again, like you said, there's this kind of stigma where, people don't really want to talk about their usage, or they're reluctant to come forward about it. And it makes it even more difficult to kind of understand both why people use it, but also how there can be effective use made for certain kinds of things that people might be comfortable with, even if they're not comfortable with using it in other kinds of ways.
Definitely. And I think the more people hear about other use cases of it, it helps to, again, demystify it and situate the tool within the context that they are familiar with, right? Because I know the example around kind of AI being able to solve complex mathematical problems in AlphaGo. And it's well, not all of us are mathematicians or AlphaGo players. So what does it look like for me, a novice researcher who, might want to use it, let's say, to find a primary source? Is that okay? Is it not okay? Or are we sort of figuring that out right now? And what are some things I should consider if I want to do that?
I mean, the funny thing is, even if, I'm thinking about graduate students again, and, having something I often think that AI is especially useful as a sort of advanced search engine, right? It's a search engine that you can actually explain what you're trying to accomplish, right? And having something like that, I can imagine, if I was doing my, philosophy graduate studies again, it would be so valuable having a resource where even if you're not necessarily pulling direct quotes or anything from it, you're literally just asking it about a corpus of material and saying, well, does this make sense? Does this cohere? Does this fit with this? Are there other resources that I'm not aware of? And it would be a really valuable tool for even purposes like that.
Yes, and because it is trained on a large corpus of data that exists on the internet, you can get a good understanding of the norm, right?
Yeah.
So you can see where your thinking kind of deviates from the norm, perhaps what you might be missing in your arguments. So there are a lot of useful ways that an emerging researcher could use it. For sure. I think there's always the risk, let's say, of putting too much emphasis or authority on what AI generates, because we understand it to have this body of knowledge that is like the entirety of the internet. So it will give me the objective truth, capital O, capital T. So I think, part of good AI literacy is also building someone's understanding of how the tool works, how it generates output, how the chatbot company that you are using to interact with the LLM, how they have configured it will impact the output that you get. Kind of all of these considerations to hold in mind as you're interacting with it.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much, I mean, tied into. I think this is why the idea of AI literacy is so important, and I'm sure we'll talk about that later.
Mm-hmm.
But now we've been talking a little bit about developing school policies and stuff relating to these different possible uses. And one of the things I'm trying to do with this program is at least cover some relevant news. And it's interesting because in recent news, there's been a number of universities who have announced different policies on AI. So the California State University just announced a very sort of pro-AI package, while schools such as the University of California and the University of Victoria and the University of California, Berkeley Law School have announced new policies to crack down on AI. And these include everything from expanding what counts as academic misconduct to banning AI for everything from conceptualizing, outlining, drafting, revising, translating, or editing any work submitted for credit. So given all of this and given this diversity of different sort of responses, what do you think should be the role for AI in education, and how should educational institutes be responding when it comes to AI policy?
This is such a big question. Let me preface this by saying I am by no means an expert in this area. However, I do think that where you have policy, you have enforcement, and a policy so strict as to say that you cannot use AI for conceptualizing, ideating, outlining. How is that going to be enforced?
Yeah.
Right. And if it can't be enforced, then like why have that policy? So I am very curious to know how the University of Victoria and the Berkeley Law School will be enforcing that policy. And I think that's probably why that sort of practical element of it is why a lot of institutions have gone the route of like guidance or overall principles to guide use, and then have like other existing policies that would cover potential misuse. So for example, like existing policies that govern things like data security might dictate how you use Gen AI tools or like what data you share with it. But having policy to say, you cannot use AI for any of these things is a bit of an invitation to do the opposite.
Yeah, so I think it's interesting because I think there's two kind of like problems I kind of see with this. So one is yeah, like how do you actually enforce these kinds of things? And so like how do you compare that to, for example, like if I talk to another person about brainstorming, conceptualizing? I mean, there's a lot of stuff that I might have in conversation with peers that may not even necessarily reach the point of sort of standard of acknowledgement. You know what I mean? Water cooler talk or something like that about a topic leads to an idea, leads to further research, right? So is that something that should be acknowledged in the case of a human just as much as you would in the case of an AI? Like, what is the actual practical difference there? If the concern is about whether you're able to essentially do the work on your own. And then the other issue is yeah, like how can you possibly kind of enforce these things? And do you run the risk of potentially creating policies that work against your own interests, right? Where people will become, people feel there's so much stigma and resistance to using AI that they won't even want to disclose it even if they're trying to be transparent about it.
Exactly. You leave no space for transparency or acting ethically when you're doing something that is automatically deemed unethical, irresponsible, or in violation of academic policy. And you're exactly right. Like others as a resource that you might use in developing your work is incredibly valuable and arguably like a very important part of learning. So where are we drawing the line between what is like original, your own thought alone versus part of your process of learning?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, particularly for example, if you tend to collaborate a lot, right? Should that be considered a mark against you if you can't do it on your own?
Yeah. What if you just like ask your buddy over lunch their thoughts on what you're putting together? I also think that a lot of these policy conversations are often misplaced. Like policy definitely needs to exist around AI, but I don't think kind of within the education space alone is where it needs to lie. Like, for example, the EU's AI Act places a lot of legislated responsibility on the safe and ethical AI on the actual tool developers themselves. And I think that's where we need to place more emphasis and more usher more responsibility on towards is those tool developers.
I mean, I often wonder too, like, I mean, again, we've talked about the fact that AI is still kind of in its early days, and I think a lot of the AI products and services out there are not necessarily designed for education in mind. And I do wonder to some extent if developers start developing, specific kinds of models and services based on AI for educational purposes that might help with a lot of these kind of concerns as well.
It might, although those kind of non-educational purpose-built tools will continue to exist, and arguably could be potentially dangerous, for children, let's say, interacting with them, who haven't developed enough like digital literacy or media literacy or just information literacy broadly, especially where kind of these AI tools are being positioned as companions or interlocutors or things like that. I think I'm skipping ahead in terms of our topics here, but ultimately, kind of where I see like AI's role in education, and I've said this in different spaces, but I think it's ultimately going to be so discipline dependent, because there are some disciplines that have really embraced AI into their pedagogy. For example, like our Ivy Business School here, they've adopted Cloudforce's Nebula One for all of their students. So all of the Ivy Business School students have access to, I think it's 5 or 6 of the paid tier LLMs. Whereas others on campus see absolutely no place for AI anywhere in and around their research or teaching. So I think our campuses, and that's the beauty of being on a campus in higher ed, is their space for all of those perspectives, those disciplines to kind of coexist and to be able to have healthy debate in that space as well. And where there is sort of that space for refusal within those disciplines, their students ultimately need to be aware of those disciplinary norms to kind of not engage with generative AI.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, personally, I've been trying to develop a framework for AI literacy, and the question of considering domain relevance and domain norms within different fields and disciplines and things like that, I think is really important. Because again, going back to this question of AI literacy, and even if you're not using it, it's really good to have an understanding of how and why other people might choose to use it, and the benefits that might come with that, so that you're not engaging in kind of reactionary attitudes or just sort of jumping to conclusions. And you can actually kind of have informed discussions about, the merits of using AI for different kinds of tasks.
Absolutely. There's definitely a discipline or a domain specific component to AI literacy. I think a lot about those students who you apply to a program, you get excited to study a particular discipline, you align yourself with the values of that discipline. And then, through breadth requirements at institutions, you engage in different elective courses and you're taking something completely outside of that discipline. And that's where sometimes these instances of AI misuse creep up because potentially you have someone who has kind of aligned their values around AI use with their discipline of choice, their home discipline. So when they are sort of plopped into other disciplinary spaces, so to speak, they don't have an understanding of that different context they're in.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's the thing. It's just, really greater awareness, I think, is kind of key. Key that and experimentation, which I think maybe brings us to my next question, which has to do with the idea of testing academic skill. And we were talking about this question before about how traditional ways of kind of doing education might need to change, and how we think about what's an effective way to test students, right? But a big concern is whether you can have sort of controlled testing. In other words, can you test a student's ability or skill without by removing them from the ability to use AI, right? So my question is, how can educational institutes still provide for controlled testing of academic skill in the age of AI? And are there perhaps, sort of creative ways in which AI can play a role in actually ensuring academic integrity?
I think when it comes to assessments of learning and AI, so again, these are those, like, let's say, checkpoints where we're looking to measure where a student is at. Often the conversation involves like assessment. It really boils down to assessment validity and reliability. So for some background, my PhD area of specialization was measurement methods. I've taught graduate courses on quantitative research methods, one of which was test construction. So these like stats terms in test construction are near and dear to my heart, and often like where I find parallels in my work. So in test construction, or in like the development of research tools like surveys, questionnaires, things like that, a tool is validated when we establish that it's kind of measuring what we intend for it to measure, and it's reliable if it measures that thing kind of consistently over time. And you need both, right? A ruler is a great example of this. A ruler kind of measures the length of something, and a standard ruler is mapped against like a standard unit of length, so like inches or centimeters. And it's a valid tool because those units of length are standardized and they're reproduced on that tool.
There
And
used to be
then,
a meter stick, an
at one
actual
point
meter
in
stick.
time.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then reliability is, when you take that ruler and let's say you measure a pencil repeatedly, and you'll notice that that pencil measures at the exact same point. It is the exact same length every time. So something needs to be both reliable and valid. So with our assessments and sort of assessment validity, we're asking the question, are we measuring what it is we're intending to measure? Like, what is the learning we're trying to measure with this assessment, and how does AI impact that? So it's really kind of stepping out of the actual assessment itself, looking at the goals of the assessment, the goal of learning. And then when AI comes into play, we're asking the question, well, how does someone kind of outsourcing that work to AI, let's say, versus doing it without AI assistance, how does that impact the validity of that assessment? And then with reliability, is the assessment dependable over time? So where the tech is changing so rapidly, and especially in assessments where students are like engaging with AI to complete the assignment, instructors have to do a lot of work here to stay like abreast of technological changes, in particular the changing abilities. And it's funny because the folks on the polls who are very like pro AI and needs to be in every assessment, we need to be prepping students for an AI future, and those who think AI has absolutely no place in academia, are both ultimately worried about assessment validity, right? I think
Well,
that
it's a common problem, I think. I mean, that's the thing too, is like despite the fact that we might disagree about AI, I think it's not that we disagree about what we're trying to accomplish at the end of the day. I mean, we all have a vested interest in making sure that the educational system works and that there's academic integrity and all these other kinds of things, right? I think it's just differences about what that actually means in practice.
That's exactly it. That's exactly it. At the end of the day, we are all concerned with students learning and being able to, in a very valid way, measure it. Um, so I think institutions should focus on supporting assessment that perhaps takes multiple approaches to achieving the same learning outcome. So bringing in those diverse perspectives around AI, so the student who wants to use it and the student who doesn't want to use it. What are some like alternative assessments, maybe some multimodal assessments, a lot of assessment flexibility, to create some space, let's say, for students who might refuse to use AI if an assignment mandates it, or let's say in the context of academic misconduct and ensuring academic integrity, let's look at the root cause of cheating. Like they're often in very high stakes assignments, students need a grade. There are very real consequences for bad grades. Students are often pressed for time. So, like, how can we kind of address these items more holistically and shift towards a culture of academic integrity instead of seeing academic integrity as like preventing cheating alone? It's a much bigger issue than that.
I
Um,
mean, yeah, again, AI makes you rethink everything, eh?
Oh my gosh, does it ever? And for me, like going back to your original question, this is something I'm optimistic about because I don't think we've ever really taken a really good look at our assessments and said, is this really actually doing what I'm hoping that it's doing? Um, and even in the context of like a lockdown and vigilated closed assessment, um, it doesn't like shifting our assessments to those proctored environment doesn't make them AI proof. There's still AI wearables, AI pens, and then some like AI detectors are not reliable. They've been proven to target like English language learners as well. So lots of biases inherent in the technologies. And though
Yeah.
there are some tells of AI use, we can only detect like poor use of AI. So I
Bullet
think,
points.
yeah, exactly. A lot of if it's not this, it's this. But yeah, I think we need some overhaul, some real good structural changes to assessment. Maybe we can break up that final major product and look at what does learning process over time look like, and how can we evaluate that?
Yeah, no, I tend to agree. I do like to some extent the fact that AI does make us kind of rethink things. Even, I delve into some issues involving AI art and stuff like that. And again, it's just an interesting question because now people are starting to ask themselves, what is aesthetics?
Oh,
Things that would have been boring a couple of years ago are now suddenly very interesting and very relevant again. So,
that
um,
question comes up frequently in our programming where we're asked the question, or we're talking about, I need to evaluate students' original work. And then there's always someone who asks, well, what is original?
yeah, yeah. So we've talked a lot about what AI literacy and developing AI literacy, and this is actually a project that I'm working on as well. So my question for you is, well, what do you think that a first year undergraduate student should know when using AI when they enter university, and how can universities make sure that they learn this quickly into their university career before it becomes a bigger problem?
We talked a little bit about kind of like being just aware of different perspectives, that nuance that exists in the conversation, those disciplinary practices and norms that guide our practices with AI as being relevant. Also, just what AI is, how it works, demystifying the technology a little bit. Like it's not magic, and people kind of treat it like magic.
Yeah.
Yeah, so kind of knowing how it works helps to both identify the tasks that might be like ideally suited for how the technology works versus those that where AI might not perform kind of as you expect. For example, hallucinations, they're not a design flaw, right?
No,
They're inherent to the design. Like once you know that your output is a prediction, a hallucination is just like a mismark or a missed
it's a
mark.
statistical anomaly. Yeah.
Exactly. It's a failed prediction. So expecting hallucinations will make you question that output by default, right? Not when something is off or like seems fishy, like every single time you will be questioning your output. So I think students need to be aware kind of how AI works, the mechanics behind it, particularly around this idea of like AI companions and AI tutors, positioning them, anthropomorphizing them, these tools having sycophantic features. Like it's necessary for students to know that these features are impacting how they interact with the tool, and that could potentially lead them to think that they're like interacting with a person, but they are not. They are interacting with a data set essentially.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, I tend to agree. Like there's a lot of just sort of fundamental, if you can understand something on a fundamental level, like it changes the way you interact with it. So for example, like you could compare one kind of AI model that might be used in actuarial science and it's designed to predict a value, right?
Mhm.
And you can ask an LLM to do the same thing, but it's not actually doing the same thing. Like it's just generating a value. It's not actually predicting a value in the same way. So if you don't understand that like different kinds of AI models do different things and are better suited for certain kinds of things and not suited for other kinds of things, then it becomes easier to sort of interact with them and understand like what they're actually doing.
Definitely how they work, and also like who is building these tools as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, students need to be aware of the biases that exist in the training data as well, how their output gets to them. It will just influence the way that they interact with the tool, hopefully in a more kind of critical way that will support their learning.
Yeah, yeah, really. I mean, that's the thing. The big thing is too again trying to make sure that everybody's on the same page relatively quickly. I think it's a sort of race against the clock to a certain extent. I mean, ideally, you'd also get to high schools, would be also helping to develop this kind of literacy and this kind of understanding too, so that you don't have students be completely blindsided by it once they get to university. And again, as we said, universities might have different institutional norms and expectations around this kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the times, at least traditionally, high schools focus on digital literacy and information literacy. And I know some have argued that we don't need a new separate literacy, that AI literacy is really just repackaged existing forms of literacy. But I think that just kind of the interface in which you interact with AI is different than traditional technologies, that it does kind of warrant its own category.
Yeah, I mean, especially the adaptive, interactive component, right? I mean, that really kind of makes it different from traditional forms of media, especially where literally it learns from you and can change how it interacts with you as well, depending on what it's trying to accomplish.
Yeah, absolutely.
So this has been a really interesting conversation about education. Hopefully we'll be having more of these kinds of conversations on the podcast as more episodes come out, because we often talk about education and AI in our group, and obviously it's a big issue and a big problem that's not necessarily going to go away. But Cortney, I want to thank you for joining me for this podcast.
Thank you for having me. I've had a really fun time. This time just completely flew by.
Yeah, I mean, it's you start talking about these issues, and the time just flies, right? Because it's usually pretty interesting.
Yep.
So, as I said, Cortney is the Associate Director of Digital Learning for the Centre of Teaching and Learning at the University of Western Ontario. I want to thank you again for joining me. Hopefully, you'll be willing to join us maybe on another episode someday.
Would love to.
Okay. So this is Matt Silk. I'm your host, and I want to thank you for joining us for another episode of the podcast. Goodbye.